My name is Annie Schmidt, and today I'd like to talk with you about basic neumes and pneumatic elements, Part 2. Here are some questions for you to test your knowledge from Part 1. What is the normal syllabic value according to the oldest sources? Describe 2 of the 6 presented theories concerning the Qualisma, and contrast semiology and mensuralism. The answers are provided for you on the next slide, but if you struggled with any of the questions, I recommend you go back to Part 1 so that you can better understand these coming segments. The only answer that I want to touch on here is that the normal syllabic value, according to the oldest sources, is long. And this is in direct opposition to the interpretation taken by Solem. So Solem makes a major error here and goes against the ancient manuscripts by interpreting the normal syllabic value as short. Here is a summary of the different neumes we talked about in Part 1, and in Part 2 we will simply be building on these elements and putting them together into different groupings. So try to keep these in your head as much as you can moving forward. The first concept we'll discuss is long versus short forms of the same pneumatic elements. So cursive variants are short forms and non-cursive variants are long forms. To try to understand this, think about normal cursive handwriting. We typically think of cursive as being faster to write out than printing, and the same concept applies in pneumatic elements. Cursive notes are both written and sung faster. So just as we must lift the pen to dot the letter I when we're writing cursive, the punctum in combination is still considered a cursive note. But we can only carry the analogy so far. The closest equivalent of crossing a T in cursive handwriting is the St. Gall epizema, which actually does lengthen a note. But I think this analogy is still very helpful to understand that cursive and non-cursive variants are different rhythmically. Cursive ones are short and non-cursive are long. The last point that I really like you to take home from this is that the epizema causes a note or group of notes to be considered non-cursive. So what does that mean? If you have 3 notes that are written in a cursive form and you have an epizema, which is just a horizontal bar, over that group of cursive notes, they are now considered non-cursive. So the epizema undoes the effect of that cursive note grouping and makes it long. In this presentation, we will discuss 2 distinct types of 2-note groups. They are the Pez and the Clevis. First, we'll discuss the Pez and all of these variants. So the first form is the long non-cursive form of the Pez, which looks like this in the Messine neumes and looks like this in the St. Gall neumes. Throughout this presentation, you will see this structure of table. So we'll always look at the name of the neume, its form in Messine, its form in St. Gall, how it's represented in the Vatican edition in the neographical forms, and in modern notation. And something we'll see throughout this is that very frequently the Vatican edition is different than the neographical forms. And this is because the Vatican edition does not take into account rhythmic markings according to the manuscripts, and the neographical forms do. So the Vatican edition is considered less accurate as compared to the neographical forms. So now getting back to the Pes Quadratus in particular, the reason that this neume is called the Pes Quadratus is because of this squared appearance. You can almost imagine the other half of the square being filled in here. So that's why it's called the Pes Quadratus. In the Messine form, it's composed of an unsinus and a virga. You might remember the unsinus from Part 1. It has this almost like the Greek letter mu look to it, and then the virga is the rod-shaped neume. The next form is the Pez Rotundus. It is the short cursive form of the Pez, and it gets its name from the St. Gall form again, because it has this round, almost oval-like appearance to it. So that's why it's called Pes Rotundus. In this case, because we are looking at the short cursive form, there is no discrepancy between the neographical form and the Vatican edition. The Pes Quadratus is composed of an eriscus and a virga in both the Messine and the St. Gall Neumes, which is kind of nice. We just have one aspect of it to remember. Pes Quadratus is eriscus plus virga. Recall that the eriscus may be either long or short according to context. So this figure is considered either non-cursive or partially cursive. I'd just like to point out here that if we go back 2 slides, we have the Pes Quadratus, which was unsinus plus virga, and the Pes Quadratus, which is eriscus plus virga. So try to differentiate those in your mind. Next is the Qualismopez. We looked at the Qualisma in part 1, and we will continue to look at the Qualisma in part 3 as the Qualisma Scandicus. So recall that the Qualisma has this characteristic appearance in the St. Gall Neumes. And I put a picture of a quill here because I can just imagine in my mind's eye a monk sitting at a table with a quill and writing out this neume, calling it a Qualisma. So if that serves as a memory prompt for you, then great. It has this appearance in the Messine Neumes. And take a moment to notice what it looks like in the modern notation. It's a shorter note followed by a longer note. And we'll return to this when we discuss a couple of other neumes in just a minute. So the Pes initio debilis is a pes with weak beginning note. And don't let the verbiage overwhelm you, especially as we move into future parts, like part 4 is what I'm thinking. So if you're new to chant, don't let this overwhelm you. We're still looking at the same old pes that we've been discussing for the past few slides, but we're just looking at a weak beginning note, an initio debilis form of it. It can also be thought of as a virga preceded by a lower auxiliary note. So for this reason, Dr. Keinsbauer calls it a virga urgens. And occasionally the Qualismopez is substituted for the Pes initio debilis. So what does this mean? It means that the two have an identical interpretation. So we could actually add something here. We could say Pes initio debilis equals virga urgens equals Qualismopez. So we can see that there's a significative letter here that we'll go into more detail later, but this T just means to lengthen this note. So this note is relatively long compared to this note. And we see something similar, a marking to lengthen the second note in the St. Gall Neumes. It's very easy to recognize this in the neographical forms. It is not so easy to recognize in the Vatican edition that the second note is clearly longer than the first. And so now it's time to go back actually to the Qualismopez. I asked you to look at this modern notation representation of the Qualismopez with a short note followed by a long note. And you see that in fact, the modern notation representation of the Pes initio debilis is identical. So just like we talked about, the Qualismopez is really identical to the virga urgens and the Pes initio debilis. Notice that in all of the variants of the Pes we explored, none of them have the rhythm long-short, according to the ancient manuscripts. And this is a main error made by Solem. Solem interprets the bottom note of both the Pes and the clavis, as we'll see in a bit, as being long. So there's a horizontal emphysema affecting only the lower note, and that is a major error that Solem makes. We'll now move on to the clavis and get to discuss some of those significative letters. So the first is the long non-cursive form of the clavis. And before we get into the details here about what they look like in the manuscripts, I just want you to understand that the clavis is the same as the Pes inverted. So the Pes had the contour low to high. We looked at that in all of those variants. It always had the contour low to high. And the clevis is just the opposite of that. We're going from a high note to a low note. So if you're able to understand that, the clevis is just an inversion. It looks like this in the messy Neumes. It's composed of two unsinuses or tractulus. So this would be read as high, low. Notice again, we have a discrepancy between the Vatican edition and the neographical forms. And this is because the neographical forms specifies rhythmic markings, and here we have the long form. Next is the short cursive form. Again, we see that high-low contour, so it'd be read as high-low. And this time there is no discrepancy between the Vatican and neographical forms because we're looking at the short cursive form. Like the Pez, the long-short form of the clevis in the Solemn edition is erroneous. So this is a major error that Solemn makes. And then the last note is, in some contexts, the partially cursive form may indicate an upper auxiliary note analogous to the Pez and ECWs, but that's a minor point. I want you to really take away this first concept. And before we wrap up, I'll just talk about diminution and augmentation in the manuscripts. We sometimes see these significative letters, such as an A or a T, or a C or an N. And these letters specify something very important about the rhythm of that neume. On this side, we have a C or an N that marks diminution, and that stands for these Latin words, which just mean quickly. So go over this note quickly. N may also be used interchangeably at the end of a pneumatic element for non tenere, not held. On the other side, we have signs of augmentation, which are either A or T. In A, you can think of it like augment. T, you can think of it like tardate, delay. So linger a little bit more on this note. That brings us to the end of part 2, looking at 2-note groupings. In the next segment, we'll discuss 3-note groupings, which I think are part of what, for me, gives chant its characteristic sound. So they're very interesting groupings to look at, and I hope you stick around for part 3. Thanks for watching.